Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the History of Dota. Today we're going to take a look at a hero that's in Dota 1, but hasn't been released yet in Dota 2. I'm talking about Azgalor the Pit Lord. Pyre Lord. Wait, no, Abyssal Underlord. Or maybe it's just Underlord now? I don't know! This hero has been through so many name changes during the port to Dota 2 that I wouldn't be surprised if he was just named something completely off the wall. So why couldn't they keep him named Pit Lord? And why has he undergone so many name changes? Well, his original name is likely a Blizzard copyright because Pit Lords are a race of demons in the Warcraft universe, and Azgalor himself was the lieutenant of the Burning Legion, so legally, the name probably had to be changed. As for Pyre Lord, only one of his spells is fire-based, so the name is a little off-base. Perhaps they had planned on Abyssal Underlord, but then when Abyssal Blade came out, they didn't want the two to be confused. On June 23rd, it was changed to Underlord, which is a little underwhelming of a name for just how massive and beastly this guy is. Anyway, enough about the names. You're probably curious about his spells and how they evolved, so let's hop right into his debut in patch 6.44. Firestorm was a spell that you cast in an area, and in that area, waves of fire come down and deal initial damage, and then burn damage for 2 seconds. This spell was pretty decent. It was non-channeling, had a 14-second cooldown, and the burn debuff refreshed its DPS duration, so it dealt about 540 damage to enemies that were affected by the entire Firestorm. You might say that it was easy to just simply walk out of the AoE of Firestorm, but that's where his next spell comes into play. Pit of Malice was another AoE spell that was quite large. You used it in an area, and any units in that area on cast or that walk into that area while the pit is active will be unable to move for 3 seconds. It's not technically a stun, but more of an ensnare. You could cast spells, but you couldn't move or use blinking abilities. If you used it on enemies while they were channeling a spell, it would also interrupt it. The pit remained on the ground for 10 seconds, and it had a 22-second cooldown. If you comboed this with Firestorm, then you were guaranteed at least 270 damage, usually more. One last really cool thing about Pit of Malice was that it pierced magic immunity, which is rare for a non-ultimate disable. And lastly, it gave unobstructed flying vision and a giant AoE around the pit. His next spell was Expulsion, and this was a really cool spell, but it didn't quite hit its peak until later versions. You used Expulsion in an area, and every second it exploded a corpse in a 375 AoE. In addition to the 80 damage each explosion did, it also mini-stunned any unit that the explosion hit. Now, corpses are not in Dota 2, so you might not be familiar with them if you never played Dota 1, but any unit, including heroes and creeps, will leave behind a corpse when they die. The corpse stayed on the ground for 15 seconds before disappearing. These are the corpses that you're exploding. So it did require some timing on the part of the caster to ensure that there were enough corpses, because Expulsion ended when there were no more corpses to explode. But with a 15-second cooldown on the spell and on the corpses, you had very little non-corpse exploding seconds. His ultimate was called Dark Portal, and while the general use of the spell is the same, it was quite a bit different back then. When Pit Lord used Dark Portal, it would literally open a portal that stayed on the ground for 15, 20, and 25 seconds at its respective levels. During those seconds, heroes could walk back and forth through the portal as many times as they liked by clicking in the middle of it. What's insane is that this Dark Portal was a global spell. You could use it anywhere on the map, whether you had vision of that area or not. You didn't have to target a unit or hero, you just targeted the ground in that spot. I can't even begin to describe to you how insanely powerful that is, other than to just compare him to Io, who is also able to do that, but can only take one other hero with him and is bound by so many extra rules. Like Io's enemy notification when teleporting, Dark Portal also notified allies and enemies of a Dark Portal creation, pinging both ends of it, and it also gave both teams vision around the portal during its duration. Now here's the catch. It wasn't an allies only spell. Enemies could use the portal as well, so it kinda defeated the purpose of Pit Lord being able to take his entire team from one pushing location to another because enemies could just follow them through the portal. The other drawback was that there was a channeling time to create the portal, so if you pressed the button to cast Dark Portal, then moved, it'd cancel the spell and go into cooldown. This also meant that enemies were able to disrupt the channeling of it, but more often than not, you'd end up canceling it yourself and getting very frustrated. It was also hard to know where to click to go through the portal, because it had to be directly in the middle and nowhere else. This, as well as enemies being able to use it, made the team fights with a dark portal very, very chaotic. All in all, this was a really cool version of Pit Lord and a close second to my favorite version, but I don't think it was all that powerful. His spells individually were not strong, but if you were able to get all three of them off in the midst of a large fight, then it had the potential to be powerful. Unfortunately, all of the damage from his spells could be countered by Black King bars. So, after that, all you're left with is a guy who devastates creep waves and can cause a bunch of chaos in fights. I guess he lives up to his legend? In 6.44b, Dark Portal underwent a pretty major overhaul. It could no longer target a portal inside base areas, and at levels 1 and 2, it couldn't target areas the player had no vision over. You could only target fogged areas at level 3. In addition, the portal only allowed each hero to use the portal one time in either direction. The cooldown was increased from 150, 120, and 90 to just 200 at all levels, and the channel time was increased by 2 seconds at each level for 6, 5, 4 channeling time. The only buffs the spell received was an increase in duration, from 15, 20, 25 to a blanket 60 seconds at all levels, and it went from 100, 200, 300 mana cost to 200, 100, 0. This really balanced the spell, but it was still problematic that the enemies could still go through the portal. In the next patch, Dark Portal was reworked once again, and was even renamed to Dark Rift. This new spell was basically the Dark Rift Underlord will likely be ported with, minus a few of the bells and whistles. When Dark Rift is used, after a channeling time of 6, 5, 4, it will teleport Pit Lord and any allied heroes within a 375 radius through the rift. Then the rift would close. You could also no longer target the ground with Dark Rift anywhere. You had to target an allied building at level 1, and at levels 2 and 3, you had the option of targeting lane creeps. While they did up the mana cost of the spell back to 300 at level 3, they reduced the cooldown to 140 instead of the previous 200. This was finally the patch that changed Pit Lord into the star hero of pushing lineups by being able to teleport his entire team from one pushing location to another after the enemy had TP'd in to defend. In 6.49, Dark Rift no longer was channeling and instead had a cast delay. This was awesome because you couldn't accidentally cancel it anymore, and you could move and cast spells while it was activating. Firestorm, Pit of Malice, and Expulsion all received minor buffs in the next patch, which made them have even more range in AoE more often. Over the next 4 patches, we saw the bells and whistles added to Dark Rift, like being able to target on the minimap to the closest unit, a visual effect on the teleport AoE for allies, increased radius of that AoE, and a small cooldown reduction. It was in 6.72 when Pit Lord received the first of his 2 major overhauls. Firestorm was changed to be a channeling spell, and instead of 6 waves of 70 damage each, it called down 3 waves of 130 damage each. It burned 15 damage a second for 3 seconds instead of 20 for 2. Honestly, this spell was really nerfed, and I really hate channeling Firestorm. The only good thing that I guess I can say about this spell is that it does 30% damage to buildings. Pit of Malice received some good changes, like dealing 100 damage to units when they're rooted, and also creating 5 corpses in the pit, and this meant great things for Expulsion. Expulsion still exploded corpses, but it was no longer centered in an AoE you defined when you used the spell. Instead, it was an instant cast spell that followed Pit Lord in a giant AoE of 600. They removed the mini-stun, and instead, Pit Lord and his allies were healed for half the damage of each exploding corpse. Now let me connect all the dots for you and happily tell you why this was such a fun version of Pit Lord to play. Expulsion and Pit of Malice both had a short 10-second cooldown. Since Pit of Malice spawned 5 corpses automatically, as long as you had 5 other corpses from heroes or creeps nearby, then you would pretty much be ready to spawn another pit when you run out of corpses, so the expulsion could last a really, really long time. All the damage and heals quickly add up, especially if the heroes were stuck in the pit or being slowed and stunned by teammates. One session of 10 explosions dealt 800 AoE damage and healed allies for 400. Pit Lord is innately tanky, and with expulsion healing him, he didn't really have to worry much about dying while he was charging in and exploding rotting corpses at anything in his path. Despite my anger towards Firestorm, this was definitely my favorite version of Pit Lord, because I'd simply just ignore Firestorm altogether and level up Pit and Expulsion. It was incredibly fun, and you can imagine my sadness when the next 3 patches brought nerfs to Expulsion before they just removed it entirely in 6.75 and gave him this piece of shit spell instead. 42% attack damage reduction as an AoE passive aura seems pretty good, but you have to realize that this only decreases base attack damage and damage from your primary attribute. Raw damage from items such as Daedalus or Monkey King Bar will not be reduced. It also doesn't reduce spell damage. And why does Pit Lord need to gain their damage? He's not a carry, he's a tanky AoE caster and has absolutely no need for bonus damage. He already creeps well enough with Firestorm. If, despite all that, you still think it's OP and good, let me rant more about the fact that it doesn't synergize with any of his other spells at all. Firestorm and Pit of Malice, although very basic spells in this version, do combo together nicely. His ultimate also combos with those two with the idea of being a pusher and anti-pusher, and provides great utility to his team. There's just no synergy with Atrophy Aura, and I firmly stand my ground that this spell should not be ported with Pit Lord. Firestorm did get changed back to its old non-channeling way in this version, which was definitely needed, and that's been the last change to Pit Lord that we know of. I'm still really holding out hope that Valve is going to blow everyone's mind with a major overhaul of his skills when he's released. I just can't get behind this version. All synergy lacking aside, he's just simply boring. While we wait for hopefully not that much longer, we're continued to be teased with concepts and teasers of Pit Lord, and so far, they've been less than appealing. This looks like some sort of spawn of Ogre Magi, and less like the muscular, demonic Pit Lord we all feared. I mean, look at this. The wings, the muscular tail, those tusk horn thingies, and my god, those demonic teeth. If this didn't give you nightmares as a kid, then you're not human. But this I would cuddle with and make my pet. Now, to be fair, I can't harp on the model that much because there was some Pit Lord concept art in the Valve headquarters back in 2013 that didn't look that bad at all. He had muscles and some cool looking armor. Also, keep in mind, Valve's initial designs are not always the most appealing, but in the end, they get it right, and I have faith that they'll do just that. With TI6 fast approaching, I'm using this cool Android app called Bets with Friends to make a bet on the final dollar amount that the prize pool will reach. The winner will receive a $20 Steam gift card from me. All you need to do is download the Bets with Friends app in the Google Play Store. Then follow and tweet at me on Twitter to be invited to the bet. One last thing. If I win, all losers pledge $2 to my Patreon. Do you accept the challenge?